Over the years, I have pulled the same trick on my children while they were growing up, and now I've been able to pull the same trick on my grandchildren. When we're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, our kids love putting together the puzzles. I would slip one of the pieces away and I would put it in my shirt pocket. Just one of those simple pleasures in life, you understand. We'll work feverishly on that 250-piece, puzzle. They're entirely dedicated, to conquering this challenge, and then we're nearing the goal, just a few more pieces in place or to be put in place, and they insist, of course, they want to do the last few pieces, and I'm happy to let them. And then comes that moment of realization, that moment of sheer terror. There's a piece missing. They'll look everywhere until they notice me smiling, and I'll open my hand and I'll say something like, "Well, would you look at that?" Then they'll make me go sit in timeout or something like that. But there's nothing worse than a missing piece. It goes for life as well, frankly. Solomon has been recording in his private journal for us some of those moments in life where pieces are missing from the puzzle. It can be frightening, it can be confusing, it can be disappointing because there's a missing piece. And throughout the first half of his journal, if you've been with us, Solomon has been recording these moments, and he does so with the elements of cynicism and despair and frustration. In the last half of his journal, now he writes again about some of these puzzling mysteries down here under the sun as he's making the observations. But now he points us to the living God. Today we're back in chapter 8 of this journal, the book of Ecclesiastes, and he's going to reveal to us what I'll call 4 puzzles in life. And unless you have a perspective that goes above the sun, if you stay stuck down here under the sun, it's going to lead you to bitterness and frustration. And Solomon is going to want to elevate our perspective above the sun as he points ultimately to God. Now let me give you the first piece of the puzzle, and then we'll look at the text. Here it is in principle form or question form. Why is it that people in power often abuse the lives of others? He writes in verse 9, "All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt." Now, the opening of the verse lets us know Solomon is saying, I've observed all this down here under the sun. By the way, that's a reference not to the things he has observed, we've covered. The way this is constructed, this is really the heading verse, the categorical heading of the next section. These are things he's observing that are not going to follow. Here's what I've seen. And his first observation is that those in authority often misuse their authority, which ought to immediately inform you that if you think that your boss or your supervisor or whoever that authority is in your life, as we looked at last Lord's Day together, wherever that authority is in your culture, that maybe they're doing something new by mistreating you. Maybe they're doing something unique. Maybe mankind is just getting worse. Well, keep in mind that Solomon is observing this behavior 3,000 years ago. This is human nature in its fallen corruption. There's a reason we have a saying, it's been around for about 200 years in the English language, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In fact, I came across one historian who wrote 100 years ago that a person's sense of morality decreases as their sense of power increases. Solomon essentially says, this is what I've seen over the course of my life. And by the way, he was guilty of it too. When his son rises to power, you may remember they ask him, would you please remove the yoke your dad put on us? The taxes, the oppression, the forced labor. Solomon is really reading his own mail here. And he's saying, in a sense, not only reflecting about himself, but what he sees under the sun. I don't know why it is that people with power abuse their power. Here's the second puzzle in life. Why is it that hypocrites often receive the loudest praise? Look at verse 10. He says this, then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place. They were praised in the city where they had done such things, their whatever it was. This also is fleeting. Then I saw the wicked buried. Solomon has evidently been to a funeral. He specifically watched someone that he knew was wicked having this elaborate funeral. In fact, the Hebrew word for wicked is used of someone who was guilty of crimes, Job 9, verse 24. Someone who refuses God's moral standards, Genesis 18:23. Someone who oppresses the innocent, Isaiah 14:5. Uses the same word. But you notice here the implication is that these people are well known. They're well respected in the community. They have a following. They're evidently wealthy enough to have a funeral where even the king is in the audience. You really got to be somebody if the king is showing up at your funeral. But according to Solomon, this person had only just stayed a little ahead of the law because they were able to die without being exposed for who they really were. And Solomon knew they were wicked. Everybody's praising them in the city. How wonderful. Why is that? That hypocrites often receive the loudest praise. It reminded me of a very wealthy man in Chicago who was known for his generosity. He lived during the difficult days of the Depression in the early 1900s, but he was rich. He was financially diversified. The Wall Street crash hadn't affected him. He was personally convinced, he would tell people, that he was blessed by God. He had enough money that during the Depression, he bought a huge 3-story building downtown Chicago, and not only paid for the building, but turned it into a kitchen, a soup kitchen for those without jobs. And he paid for the building, and then he paid for all the food out of his own pocket. He had a huge sign he had hung out front that announced food for the unemployed. And they had 3,000 people a day being fed there. Once they gave away over 100,000 meals, they quit counting. He remained anonymous. He didn't want praise for it, but he was often in the public eye. With all this widespread gratitude, reporters began to get on the trail to find out who they called him Mr. Good Deed was. We had to find Mr. Good Deed. When they finally identified him, this businessman and wealthy philanthropist was honored by throngs of grateful people. People wanted his autograph. A well-known school of journalism in Chicago voted him among the top 10 outstanding people in the modern world history. Right up there, they put him with Gandhi and Charles Lindbergh and Albert Einstein. Top 10. He loved baseball. It wasn't unusual for him to enter the stadium and everybody rise, thousands of people, and applaud. He sided with those who wanted to censor motion pictures. He joined anxious parents in publicly calling for an end to movies which he said were doing nothing but harming young people. In one interview he said, and I quote, "Honor and truth and the law are falling from public respect." a paragon of virtue. Only near the end of his career did public opinion change when the full story came out about who Al Capone really was. This compassionate and caring philanthropist, this movie censor, this man deeply concerned about honor and truth and the law. Solomon says, I saw somebody like that get buried. They never did get found out, but I knew. He adds, by the way, this interesting fact. Notice here, again in verse 10, these people who died, they used to go in and out of the holy place. You get the implication of that. Pious. Not just do good, but religious. These people would have been recognized on the temple grounds. He used to go in and out of the holy place. Solomon writes it as if the guy had a key to the front door. The priests would have known his name. I saw a wicked individual buried, and you should have heard how they praised him. You should have heard what was said by the priest at his funeral. Man, he had all the trappings of religious piety. It was all for show. He went through the religious motions, and that was about it. He had it all down pat. It was all hand motions. Reminds me of the humorous story I read recently. Two friends were sitting in the audience waiting for a boxing match to begin. And they noticed as both boxers got out into the ring, one boxer kind of bounced around, stretching. The other boxer knelt down, kissed the mat, got on his knees, crossed himself several times, bowed his head in prayer, and then pointed up to the ceiling. One of the men asked his friend, "What does that all mean?" The guy responded, "If he can't box, it doesn't mean a thing." All the religious motions and piety and good deeds. And Solomon asks, why is it that people like that never get found out? Here's a third puzzle he mentions. I'll put it this way. Why is it that the wheels of justice turn slowly and sometimes not at all? Look at verse 11. He writes, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times, that's his way of saying he just keeps doing it, and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow because he does not fear before God. Solomon now in this text takes us full circle. But notice how he begins. Justice isn't served. People are getting away with crime. He adds here, a sinner does evil 100 times, and this is what, and he lives a long life. That bothers him. He lives a long life. He's gotten away with it. Now, this doesn't mean justice shouldn't be pursued or that those representing the law shouldn't represent the law well. It's an honorable demonstration, by the way, and it actually reflects the character of a righteous God. But Solomon says here that one of the puzzling things about life is that evil people seem to get away with breaking the law, and they repeat the crime 100 times. And maybe it's because they're clever enough to evade the law. Maybe they had a good lawyer. Maybe they had connections. But never mind that, because Solomon wants to point you just a little further down the path. Did you notice? He compares their life to a shadow. Their lives are lengthened like a shadow. Let me ask you a question. When do shadows grow long? Just before the sun sets. So this individual's life, it seems to get longer and longer, and it seems he's never going to die, but just like a shadow, the longer it grows, the nearer they are to running out of daylight, is the point. No one is clever enough, no one is well connected enough to, in the end, get away with their crime. They cannot prevent the nightfall of death, where the Bible says in Numbers 32, verse 23, you can be sure your sins will what? Find you out. The Bible tells us, by the way, in Revelation chapter 20 of that judgment day when all the unredeemed of all of human history will be brought to court. It will be a just court. The judge and jury are the holiness and righteousness and justice of God. It describes it for us, and it is nothing less than a terrifying scene. And God the Son, we're told, will open the books for himself, the books that have recorded in them everyone's sins, large and small, motive and plan and thought and deed, everything exposed. Everyone will be tried, and the Apostle Paul describes it in Romans chapter 3, verse 19, where he says at the end of it, every mouth will be shut. In other words, everyone will be tried before the holy jury of God's character, and there will be no excuses. They'll run out of reasons. Everyone will not have sufficient answers. Ultimately, everyone will be convinced of their guilt. That's the terror to me of it. They will be convinced that they are indeed guilty. And then that gavel will strike the bench, and the sentence of everlasting judgment will echo out, and it will be undeniable, it will be unalterable, it will be irrefutable, it will be unchangeable. It's going to be eternal. All the shadows, they were long. This person lived a long time. That gavel will sound. What hope, by the way, do you have? What hope do I have? We have filled volumes ourselves with sin. The only hope, when measured against God's holy standard, is that we have believed the gospel and placed our faith in Jesus Christ. And John the Apostle writes, then we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, who is perfect. He has already spoken on our behalf, as it were, to the jury of God's righteous judgment. Yes, he sinned. Yes, she sinned. Yes, they have sinned. Oh, how they have sinned. They have sinned. But because they trusted in my death on behalf of their sin, I have already experienced then their sentence of separation. I have already experienced their place of wrath before God. I've already paid in full the penalty of every one of their thoughts and deeds. They go free. For all who refuse the gospel and reject the Savior and won't acknowledge their sinfulness, this coming scene of judgment is called the Great White Throne, in a reference to the holy purity of God. And it is the missing piece in Solomon's puzzle here in this text. This is where a holy God makes all things just and right. There's one more puzzle I want to bring to your attention in the mind of Solomon here. Fourthly, why is it that someone isn't rewarded fairly for what they've accomplished in life? Notice verse 14. There is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. Now, what he's basically saying is, why is it that sometimes wicked people are treated as if they're good people, and good people are treated as if they're wicked people? I thought life was supposed to be fair. I thought if you worked hard and you did your homework, and you paid your taxes, and you took your vitamins, and you smiled at strangers, and you never swore, at least not out loud, you'd be in for one treat in life after another. And Solomon says, when it doesn't happen, I just can't figure that out. When the one who deserves the promotion doesn't get it, and the slacker gets it. When the cheater becomes the valedictorian and you slugged through and you missed it by 0.002%. The reason we struggle with that is because there are pieces to the puzzle that God is still holding in his hand. So what do we do until he reveals them? Well, Solomon shifts now, and he's going to give us two pieces of advice. Notice verse 15. And I commend joy for man as nothing better under the sun, but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him, that since has prescribed him or assigned him under the sun. Now, Solomon is not, even though it sounds familiar, he's not recommending the hedonistic version of eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you die. That's the fatalistic philosophy of the unbeliever. Solomon is essentially recommending the joy that comes from trusting the Lord, thanking the Lord who gives us all things richly to enjoy, 1 Timothy 6:17. So in principle form, Solomon is giving us this advice. Thank God for blessings that have arrived from every corner. If you have a job, thank God. If you have a meal in front of you, thank God. Enjoy it. Make the most of it. Whatever it is, those overlooked simple blessings, by the way, those simple blessings become profound when you don't have them. So if you have them, if they've arrived, thank God for those blessings that have arrived from every corner, and we are daily loaded with benefits, wrote the psalmist. We just overlook them. Secondly, trust God for burdens that are just around the corner. Notice verse 16. When I applied my heart to know wisdom, to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep. In other words, as I try to figure this stuff out, I lose sleep. Then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. That is, you can't quite figure God out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. Wisdom is a wonderful thing, but it doesn't give you the answer to everything. There's no way to know what's coming around that corner. You just can't figure life out that far down the path. You have very little idea of what God's doing on the planet, much less what he's doing with your own life. We don't know what God has planned for this afternoon or tomorrow or next year. You're going to lose sleep to try to figure it out. Solomon writes, if you worry about what you can't see coming. The trouble is you can't see around the corner, and life is filled with corners, isn't it? What's going to happen? Well, it might not happen. Mark Twain once wrote with a smile, there has been much tragedy in my life, and at least half of it actually happened. Thank God for what's happening that you can see. Trust God for whatever is going to happen that you can't yet see. You know, when I put those puzzles together lately with my grandchildren, that last piece is missing, and I'll just usually say something like, well, I wonder where it is. They'll shake the box. They'll look under the table on their hands and knees. I'll tell them to check their pockets, and they do. And then I'll show them. It's in my hand. As I thought about that, here's the convicting part of this analogy. I can only do that with them one time, maybe twice, for some of my slower grandchildren. The next time I try it, what do? Ah, Papa, you've got it. And they'll come over to me. What's convicting is I'm a lot slower than they are. Because the second time or the fifth time or the 100th time, there's a piece missing in the puzzle, and I look everywhere. I lose sleep. I'm convinced it's got to be around here somewhere. How often do we learn and then relearn and then relearn? Oh, you've got it. It's in your hand. When will we learn more quickly to look to him and say, hey, you've got that one. You haven't put it on the table yet. Life is filled with puzzles. Frankly, every one of them is missing a piece. As if to remind us that God must remain the main piece, the key piece, the primary piece. It's as if Solomon is reminding us with these puzzles here that God will be, and frankly, God must be the final piece, who puts it all together and completes the picture. In the meantime, we thank him for what we can see and enjoy, and we trust him for what we have yet to see in his sovereign plan.